Hello everyone and welcome to yet another terrifying corner, one that is so gatekept it's terrifyingly exclusive. The faction that we're going to talk about and the knowledge itself would likely get anyone in universe to have a little visit from the authorities. We're talking about the one, the only, the Grey Knights, the legendary chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, number 666. Now I want you to picture this. Your standard space marine is a 7-foot tall super soldier in brightly colored power armor, right? However, to create a Grey Knight, you take that, wrap it in unpainted silvery gray ceramite, give it the soul of a holy inquisitor and the power of the god emperor as their primogenitor, like the primarchs are for the standard space marine chapters, and you have an army of some of the greatest psychers to ever exist. To the rest of the Imperium, officially they don't exist. They are a campfire story, a myth shared by soldiers who have seen too much. If you're in the Imperial Guard and you see a silver ghost appearing on the battlefield to save you from a literal demon, you don't celebrate. You aren't going to get a medal. You aren't going to go home and be able to impress the canoness into going on a date with you. They're likely going to put a nice little bullet to your brain just to keep the secret. The basic idea is that this legion operates on the peripheral of the Imperium's history, leaving behind nothing but whispers and empty battlefields. They are explicitly the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus of the Inquisition, much like the Death Watch are the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos. Basically, these guys are the Inquisition's specialized hit squad for anything that crawls out of the warp. And their home base isn't some far-flung fortress monastery on the edge of the galaxy. It's hidden in one of the most heavily fortified places in existence, right under the Emperor's very nose on Saturn's moon Titan. It's a private, dark sanctuary where they undergo a selection process so grueling and torturous that it makes standard Space Marine training look like a summer cheer camp, pom-poms and all. These guys aren't just built to fight, they're built to endure the unendurable. However, what makes them truly terrifying, and honestly kind of cool, is that every single member is a rather potent psyker. In a universe where using psychic powers is basically like screaming into a void filled with sharks with a bunch of paper cuts in your face, these guys have mastered the control of the Imperium. They use something known as a psychic aegis, which is a halo of protective wards that makes them anathema to the creatures of chaos. They can pick up forbidden soul-rotting artifacts or read blasphemous tomes that would turn a normal man into a puddle of madness and oozing extra limbs, then just not care about it. They've been around for some rather long 10,000 years, and in all that time, through all that temptation and horror, not a single Grey Knight has ever defected to chaos. Not one. In a setting as bleak as 40K, where even the Adeptus Custodes can be puppeteered by the machinations of the four craven gods, that's an unbelievable track record. However, that purity does come with a cost. This isn't your standard Brotherhood of Glory. It's a brotherhood of almost absolute silence, as they bear the sigil of Malcador, literally tattooed onto their flesh and etched onto their armor, as a direct link back to the Emperor's closest confidant when he founded them during the Horus Heresy. They also incidentally carry the Emperor's literal gene seed, making them his true sons in a way that most other chapters and even the Adeptus Custodes can only dream of. Yet they remain the Imperium's best kept secret, as they move through the battlefield like silver ghosts, striking at the heart of sorcery and madness, and then they just vanish back into the dark. Unless, of course, you're the Space Wolves with that protagonist energy, but that's a story for much later. For now, just know that if you see silver armor, the nightmares are over, but your life is probably over too. So it's a mixed bag. Now you might be wondering, just how exactly does someone join this mystical chapter? Well, you don't really join, because join implies choice. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, choice is often a luxury. The recruitment process for the Grey Knights is less of an enlistment and more of a galaxy-spanning psychological horror story. It starts with the company gatherers. These are veteran Grey Knights, often too old or too catastrophically injured for frontline combat, who have essentially been given the task of roaming the galaxy looking for younglings with psychic potential. And they aren't just looking for volunteers. They'll pull recruits from the absolute worst places imaginable. Feral planets, penal colonies, and even the infamous Black Ships, the massive, dread-filled vessels that round up psychers to be sacrificed or sanctioned on Terra. The gatherers don't care at all about a recruit's background, their crimes, their consent, or even if they have already been claimed by another chapter. All they care about is mental fortitude and psychic power. If a recruit is selected, they are brought back to the Sol system, specifically Saturn's moon, Titan, but they aren't welcomed with warmth. Instead, shivering and disoriented, they are dropped into the freezing, inhospitable plains of Titan and simply told to walk to the Citadel gates. If a recruit looks at the distant black towers and decides to turn back, or to take their chances in the frozen wilds, they are executed for cowardice, not through a bolter round, but their very soul being blasted by the Grey Knights. But reaching the gates is just a prologue. They will immediately be sent back out into the cold on a 1,000-kilometer trek towards the Xanadu region. This isn't just a hike, it's a death march through a caustic, climactic haze that literally unravels your mind. To survive, a recruit must navigate absolute nightmares, including the Anarch High Pass, where a single whispered word triggers avalanches of choking chemical dust. The Rusting Desert, a literal wasteland with a litany of broken void ships, along with roaming packs of decaying insane servitors who might just be looking to add you to their ranks. And last but not least, the Saturnine Maze, an ancient haunted weapon of war left over from the Great Crusade, filled with the spirits of vanquished warriors. All the while, these untrained psychers are wearing an explosive inhibitor collar. If the toxic fumes and the alien visions cause them to lose control of their psychic powers, the collars will automatically detonate. And when looking at it, the landscape of Xanadu is literally carpeted with thousands upon thousands of headless skeletons from aspirants who couldn't quite make it. For the rare few who actually make it out of the icy waste, the true horror of their transformation begins, as they go under severe psychosurgery and must survive the 666 rituals of detestation, proving they can withstand the horrors that would shatter a normal Space Marine's mind. To ensure absolute incorruptibility, their past and who they were is erased. They are literally mind wiped, down to the point that they only understand how to function as a living being. Little else is still there. Every memory of their family, their fears, their childhood, their very identity gone, as silver purity wards are implanted directly beneath their skin in order to repel demonic entities. They are then implanted with what the chapter calls the Emperor's Gift. Unlike other Space Marines who carry gene seed of their primarch, the Grey Knights carry the genetic material of the Emperor himself in a modified organ that is actually significantly more resilient than that of a standard Space Marine. However, comparisons to the Primaris organs has not been made as of yet. Perhaps the most haunting part of this entire process is the naming. During this brutal ritual of training, no recruits have names, only numbers. Those who die are tossed in unmarked graves and completely forgotten by the universe. Only when they have fully transcended their humanity are they given a name, pulled from the darkness and sealed within the history books of the Inquisition. This new name isn't just an identifier, it's a weapon, because in the warp, names, in particular true names, hold absolute power over demons. Therefore, a Grey Knight's name is a fragment of arcane lore and engineering, designed to be the exact opposite. A perfect counter to a specific demon. Every Grey Knight is a perfect counter to a specific demon's true name, as just standing in the presence of the Grey Knight and hearing his name spoken causes literal agony to many a creature of the warp. And as so, they have been stripped from their humanity, their past, their identity, and completely rebuilt from the ground up to a greater extent than any of the other tools of the Emperor's design have been, to be the ultimate silver-clad nightmares for the monsters that dwell in the dark. If you really want to understand just how deeply woven the Grey Knights are to the darkest corners of the Imperium, we have to look back at their founding. And I use history rather loosely here because most of the records regarding their creation have been completely scrubbed from existence, and what little lore there is surrounding it out of universe is nebulous at times. This all started during the absolute worst days of the Horus Heresy. The Emperor, in his terrifying foresight, knew that the war was going to break him. He knew that he wouldn't be able to actively defend humanity against the creeping horrors of the warp once the dust was settled. So in secret, he tasked his closest confidant, Malcador the Sigillite, with building the ultimate failsafe. Malcador scoured the burning galaxy and brought together 12 champions to bear this impossible burden. 4 of these men were lords and administrators, while the other 8 were space marines. And here's where the subtle, creeping panic of the era set in. Many of these chosen space marines were actually from traitor legions. They were men whose brothers and fathers had turned to chaos, but who had souls pure enough that would allow them to remain fiercely and stubbornly loyal to the Emperor. Their pasts were erased and their original identities buried, and they were given new names including Janus, Epithymus, Chiron, Chios, Ogun, Latop, Jotun, and they even included a son of Sanguinius with Satyr. Once the Emperor gave his final blessing, this secret society was split up. The four lords vanished into the shadows to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become the Inquisition, while Malcador and his 8 space marines traveled to Saturn's moon, Titan. When they arrived, Titan wasn't just a barren rock. It was a fully stocked, pre-prepared fortress monastery, secretly populated with hundreds and hundreds of raw recruits, stockpiles of pure, uncorrupted gene seed created from the Emperor's very own genetic template. Malcador named Janus as the first true supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. Unfortunately, he couldn't stay to lead his personal cadre. He had a war to finish, so before he left, Malcador performed what might be the greatest, most terrifying magic trick in humanity's history. To protect this fragile new brotherhood from traitor armadas, he didn't just cloak the moon, he took Titan and hid it within a pocket of the warp itself. Surrounded by a microgalafield array, along with a litany of arcane sigils he and the Emperor personally designed, the entire moon and everyone on it just vanished from real space, swallowed up by the very hell dimension they were created to fight. In a true lost colony scenario, but of a cosmic scale. By the time Titan finally slipped back into reality, the Horus Heresy was over. The Emperor now on the Golden Throne, and the Second Founding fully underway. But because time is a fluid thing in the galaxy full of nothing but war, strife, and horror, years had passed differently for the men on Titan. What was a brief disappearance from real space was enough time for the Grey Knights to emerge, not as the 8 founders and a handful of new recruits, but as a fully realized, fully trained chapter of 1,000 elite battle brothers. The Inquisition, run by the successors of those original 4 lords, quietly slipped them into the registry and designated the Grey Knights as Chapter 666 as a dark inside joke, considering that at the time only a scant 400 chapters existed. And just like that, the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus was born, a ghost army that stepped out of hell, literally fully formed to fight the devil himself. So we've talked about where they came from, and we've talked about how they're made, but how do they actually function in a galaxy that's actively trying to eat itself? This is where the story of the Grey Knights goes from cool secret agent vibe into something much more macabre and morally grey. For about 1,500 years after the heresy, the chapter was essentially ghosts in the machine. One of the original founders, Kirill Sandman, who was then going by the name Inquisitor Veritas, kept them hidden even from the rest of the Inquisition. He believed that they were a weapon too precious to be wasted on normal wars, even during the apocalyptic War of the Beast, when the Imperium was nearly crushed by the most powerful orc to ever exist in modern history. The Grey Knights stayed in the shadow. Veritas eventually passed the keys, literally keys, to a successor, sparking the formal split of the Inquisition into Ordos, the very Ordos we know today, and the Grey Knights officially becoming the Iron Fist of the Ordo Malleus. But staying secret is a rather messy job, and the Month of Shame is probably the most haunting example of just how far they'll go to maintain the veil. In the 41st millennium, during the First War for Armageddon, a full brotherhood of Grey Knights took on a literal demon primarch, Angron, and they barely won, but it cost them greatly. Only about a dozen knights walked away from the battlefield. However, the horror didn't end there when the demons died and chaos was pushed from the planet, because the civilian population and the Imperial Guard had seen the Grey Knights and the demonic incursion. This meant the Inquisition ordered a total purge of all those within the populace. We're talking about executing heroes and sterilizing entire planets just to keep secrets. This actually led to a Cold War with the Space Wolves, who weren't just about to let their allies be slaughtered by silver ghosts, regardless of the fact that those who witness chaos are much more likely to end up even incidentally spreading it. This is but a chilling reminder that to the Grey Knights, a few billion lives are a fair price to pay for a secret that protects the very soul of humanity. Fast forward to the modern era and the age of the Dark Imperium, and things have gone from grim to bloody desperate. With the Great Rift having torn the galaxy asunder, the Grey Knights are being stretched far too thin and into their absolute breaking point. The Supreme Grandmaster Caldor Drago is even lost deep within the warp. Half of their entire High Council is dead, and the Black Ship, their primary source for recruits, are being lost to chaos at higher and higher rates. This has forced the chapter to do things they'd never dream of. Now they have essentially started raiding other Imperial institutions and even other Space Marine chapters to kidnap psychic recruits, and even those who have partial gene seed implantation already commenced, all the while scrubbing any evidence that they were there. This is a classic staring at the abyss problem, but in a giant casing of steroids, ceramite, and magic powers. To fight the ultimate evil, the Grey Knights have become a force that operates entirely outside of human morality. They are a light in the dark, but it's cold and sterile, and that light will burn you just as fast as the darkness will consume you. They're currently fighting a losing battle on 1,000 fronts, heroes being extinguished far too soon and much faster than they can be replaced, causing them to lead on exterminatus more and more and more. They are the Imperium's true final line of defense, but you have to wonder if the Grey Knights are the only thing left standing, what kind of galaxy is left to save. Now, if you stuck with me so far, you're starting to realize that the Grey Knights aren't just a regular chapter, they're an entire parallel reality within the Imperium. Their organization is incredibly isolated from society, and it really hits home when you see that they don't only ignore the Codex Astartes, the very rulebook that almost every other Marine chapter lives by. They split their chapter into 8 brotherhoods, each led by Grandmaster. These brotherhoods are essentially ghost units spread across the thin veil of reality in even tinier cells, fighting together for their entire lives without seeing another friendly face. They operate on a psychic frequency called an egregore, which is a collective mental link that lets them fight as one mind, one soul, and one blade. It's an incredibly efficient combat method that allows them to continue fighting without even having to speak. They just know what to do. At the very top of this pyramid sits the Supreme Grandmaster. This is a rank so prestigious and so dangerous that a candidate can only take the seat if every other Grandmaster agrees unanimously, as there is no room for error, no room for politics. Under them is a hierarchy, which is an extremely specialized machine of holy destruction. You have the Brotherhood champions, warriors who have literally given up every other form of combat just to master the blade. While you were learning to play guitar, they were mastering the blade. While the Blood Angels were creating just the most beautiful fresco, the Brotherhood champions were mastering the blade. And while the Space Wolves were getting drunk as a skunk, you guessed it, they were studying the blade. They act as living shields for their captains. You also have the Librarians, who are psychic powerhouses even by Grey Knight standard, and the beloved Chaplain. These are rather rare within the Grey Knights, as they are iron-willed priests who ensure that even after 10,000 years, the record of 0 defections to chaos remains unbroken. And then there are the prognosticators, the seers who sit in the dark and listen to the ripples in the warp, predicting where a demon will appear before they even contemplate breaching the Imperium for reality. But perhaps the most unsettlingly named of their order are the ones which aren't talked about in the light. Take the Ferrymen. These are former Grey Knights who have somehow become pariahs, beings with literally no soul whose very presence causes extreme physical pain to psychers. They spend their eternity tending to the dead field, massive cemeteries on Titan where the fallen are laid to rest. It's a lonely, silent end for those heroes who are literally turned into a cancer to themselves. And then there's the newer, darker change which has recently been noticed. The chapter has taken the flesh cages. Recently, some librarians have started bartering human souls to demons in exchange for their true names, only to trap these demons in warded mortal shells in order to put them into stasis. This is a desperate borderline heretical gambit, using the enemy's own essence against them in a way that would get any other chapter executed on the spot. However, it does bring results, as even some greater demons of Khorne and Slaanesh have been caught in similar manners. And when they finally go into war, they don't just march, they arrive like a lightning strike, because they almost all wear some form of Terminator armor, the most massive tank-like protection the Imperium has. And they often teleport directly into the heart of the nightmare that they seek to slay. They appear as a flash of silver light to clear the infestation with psychic fire and nemesis blade on hand. And then, just as fast as they arrived, they're gone. They leave to clean up the very messy, mundane parts of war, killing all the cultists, rebuilding the infrastructure, getting anybody who was out of line back in line, to the Imperial troops and other Space Marine chapters, who don't even realize that their saviors were there until they were being rounded up for processing. It's a cold, clinical, and terrifyingly efficient way to save the species, and it's all managed from a moon that officially isn't there anymore, by men whose very names are now weapons, and whose lives were over the moment they reached the gates of Titan. Now I want to talk about the things that they actually leave behind, the stories that aren't supposed to exist. You see, for 10,000 years, the Grey Knights have been fighting a war that history has been paved in blood to forget. Their victories are recorded only in the faded ink of the Sanctum Sanctorum on the very moon of Titan, a library of horrors that would melt a normal man's brain. When you look through these records, you'll see patterns of sacrifice that feel less like military history and more like a collection of dark folklore. The kind of stories that make you look at your closet in fear when you hear the barest creak of a door at night. Take, for instance, the Ghost Quell of M33, where the Grey Knights tracked down a radical inquisitor by the name of Veritix, a man who claimed that he had found the only hope for the Imperium's survival. They decided not to listen to his pleas. They didn't deliberate on his philosophy. They simply dragged him back and sent him to the silent dungeons of Titan, his warnings echoing off the stony faces that haven't felt pity in millennia. Or consider the final sanction at Zor, where a brother captain named Neoden killed a demon-possessed butcher, only to realize the corrupted meat had already been shipped to neighboring worlds. He didn't launch a recall. He didn't call the doctors. He decided to call an exterminatus, condemning millions in order to save billions, just to be sure that the tainted flesh wouldn't spread its curse. In their world, it's better for 1 billion to die than for one demon to live and spread to corrupt further trillions. There's a strange, almost poetic tragedy to their service, like the lost brotherhoods of the Velted region. Brother Captain Edion and his men vanished in M43 while hunting a demon, and they were declared dead and forgotten for 2,000 years. Then suddenly, a coded signal reached Titan. As it turns out, Edion had followed the creature into a pocket of the warp, where time didn't exist. How that works, your guess is as good as mine. And they fought at the foot of the fortress, dying every single day only to rise again, by sheer psychic will, over and over for 2 millennia. When they finally won and slipped back into real space, the weight of those thousands of years hit them all at once. Their bodies atrophied into dust, leaving nothing behind but a victory report and a few suits of empty silver armor. Now, the idea of a group of people just being erased from time and space, leaving only a whisper of who they were, is truly terrifying, at least to me. But maybe the most unsettling story yet is the haunting of Titan itself. In M35, the Chambers of Purity, the most sacred place on the entirety of the moon, began to be haunted by the ghosts of demons the Grey Knights had actually killed. These weren't just hallucinations, they were shadows clawing at the very walls of reality itself, whispering that the Emperor's light would eventually fail, and that the Grey Knights would one day stand completely alone in the dark. However, the Purifiers just laughed it off as demonic lies, but they also knew the terrifying truth. Those ghosts were just a symptom of something much more ancient and powerful that slumbers deep beneath the surface of Titan, as they had found out that they were literally living on top of a nightmare that they couldn't quite identify. From the quiet heresy where an entire planet was robbed of its speech and turned into a silent arbiter, to the demon assassins that tried to hide amongst their recruits, only to be out-hunted by a mere child. The history of the Grey Knights is a long and dark road paved in secret. They indeed are the 666th chapter, the silver ghosts of Saturn, the men who gave up their names in order to become weapons. And if you ever find yourself on the battlefield and see a silver flash, just remember that the monsters are real and the heroes are ghosts, and you're probably not supposed to be alive to tell the story. Now, as we near another breakpoint, we reach M37 and the demon maze, one that's filled with such recurring wrongness. When a heretic named Malfora tried to build a machine to harness the power of the warp, and accidentally created a multi-dimensional labyrinth of ghost glass, it became a trap for demons, who were lured there only to get lost by the twists and turns. When the Grey Knights arrived, they had to step into the world of flickering reflection and psychic illusions, hunting monsters through a literal house of magic mirrors, ones which shouldn't even exist in our reality, in a place where the rules of physics just stop applying. But the Grey Knights don't just fight monsters, they fight the corruption of their own kind. The story of the Tarnished Blades is one such tale. The Astral Blades chapter was led to damnation by their chapter master, who had been hollowed out and possessed by a rather powerful demon. They slaughtered their brothers and stole their gene seed, trying to flee to the Eye of Terror. However, the Grey Knights were already there and waiting, just out of view within higher orbit, and they didn't just decide to destroy the ship. They teleported onto the bridge and delivered the Emperor's piece to the chapter master, who realized too late what he had become. And then there's moments where the warp decides to take what they want. This includes the damned voyage of 394 M40, which is the literal stuff of nightmares, where the Grey Knight strike cruiser, the Titan's Hand, suffered a Geller field malfunction mid-transit. Imagine being trapped in a metal tube in the middle of hell while the lights just go out. The crew and serfs, along with the servitors, were instantly possessed or driven mad by a cadre of powerful demons, turned into literal puppets of chaos. The Grey Knights, though, they didn't panic. They stood there, haloed in their own psychic shielding, protecting their minds through sheer willpower, as they fought through the halls of their own ship. When the vessel finally was spat back into reality, the Grey Knights were still standing, but they were the only thing alive on the bridge, covered in the remains of their crew. But perhaps the most 40k out of all these incidents as of now, prior to M41, would be the conviction of souls, which was caused when a planetary governor tried to be pious by publicly executing 666 heretics. He didn't realize that the very pageantry of the execution was actually the final step in a very complex demonic ritual. As the last head fell, a hole ripped open in reality and a Slaneshi demon prince stepped through. But now, he, she, or it was wearing the governor's skin, like a meat suit. The planet quickly became a playground for madness, where the citizens would be forced into blood games and all manners of depravity, both sick and twisted alike. When the Grey Knights arrived, they had to fight through labyrinths made of living, screaming flesh, whose consciousness was all but intact. They eventually won, but the cost was rather high and the taint so deep that they ended the mission by piling the bodies of the innocent cities onto the heretics to seal the breach. Now you know that the Grey Knights aren't just silver-clad soldiers. They're the ultimate uncompromising end to any story involving the warp. But sometimes the lack of compromise turns inward, and the very structure designed to serve humanity begins to tear it apart. Now is when we talk about the Space Wolves' legendary saga, The Months of Shame, a conflict that feels right out of a fan's personal repertoire. Before the shame, there was the fire. In the late 41st millennium, the storms of judgment lashed the car yard sector, driving millions insane overnight. It was here that Inquisitors first recorded the Gore Feaster, a cornate abomination of pure madness, muscle, and sinew alike. This was a prelude to the first War for Armageddon in 444 M41, when the Space Hulk Devourer of Stars was vomited into reality and spewed out a horde led by the demon primarch Angron himself, the man, the myth, the legend, onto the very surface of the world of Armageddon. The defense was legendary, led by Logan Grimnar and 300 of his Space Wolves. He held the line until a full brotherhood of 109 Grey Knights teleported directly into the heart of this nightmare. It was a titanic clash of gods and monsters, leading them to, at the final moment, through great sacrifice, to banish Angron and his bloodthirster guard. But the cost was staggering. Out of the 109 Grey Knights, 96 of them were slain, and 9 more of them were crippled for life, leaving only a handful to be able to properly walk away of the situation. Heroes like Aran Stern and Garon Crow, whose names would go to define the chapter for generations to come. Because the population of Armageddon had seen not only the Grey Knights, but even worse, they had been in direct contact with the demon primarch Angron. The Inquisition had decided that they could not be allowed to live as they were. and ordered the final sanction, where the entirety of the surviving population, billions of people who had fought and bled for the emperor, were to be sterilized, rounded up into work camps, or simply liquidated. To the Inquisition, it was a cold and necessary math to prevent the spread of the chaos taint, which, through further lore dives, you'll find out that it spread. To Lorgren Grimnar and the Space Wolves, this was an unforgivable betrayal of the very people the Imperium was supposed to protect. What followed was a years-long cat-and-mouse game across the stars, known as the Months of Shame, where the Grey Knights, acting as the Inquisition's Iron Fists, were ordered to destroy troop transports carrying Armageddon's refugees. The breaking point came in 451 M41, when an inquisitorial armada surrounded Fenris, the Space Wolves' very homeworld, threatening to burn it from orbit. The parley that followed was legendary. The Space Wolves woke up Bjorn the Fell-Handed, a dreadnought who had actually fought beside the Primarch Leman Russ. Even the Grey Knights showed deference to him as a living piece of history, but the peace would be shattered when Lorgren Grimnar arrived and beheaded an Inquisitor Lord on his own bridge. In the chaos, a Grey Knight named Hyperion, known as the Blade Breaker, confronted Grimnar, and in a display of raw psychic fury, Hyperion actually cracked Grimnar's Morkai with his very mind. It was a moment of absolute tension, where two of the Imperium's most powerful warriors were at each other's throats, while the galaxy around them burned. However, Bjorn eventually stepped in, forcing a bitter truce. The Grey Knights would leave Fenris, and the Space Wolves would keep their secret, alongside a permanent watch over the surviving citizens of Armageddon, who had been dispersed. But the damage was done. The Months of Shame had left a scar on the Imperium that will never truly heal. The Space Wolves have never trusted the Inquisition since, and the Grey Knights lost nearly 100 battle brothers, not to demons, but to the war of bureaucracy and secret. Now we have to talk about moments where the Grey Knights stopped being soldiers and started acting as the universe's ultimate cold-blooded janitors. There is this recurring theme in the history of 40K, specifically of unwelcome alliances. Moments where the enemy of my enemy is still a nightmare, but a slightly less urgent one. Take Brother Captain Randstorm on the dead world of Saitor. He's currently hunting a cornate beast called the Blood Wolf, and just as he corners it, a tomb of black glass hisses open, and Necron's soulless metallic Xenos march out. This becomes a quick and dastardly three-way brouhaha in the ruins of a ghost world. Thane watches the Blood Wolf try to tear apart a Necron Lord, and in that moment of distraction, he lands a killing blow. In one of the weirdest standoffs in 40K history, the Necron Lord lowers his weapon as a gesture of parley, and Fan, battered and weary, just leaves. He doesn't stay to fight the robot. He has his prize. He's only supposed to be dealing with the demonic. However, Fan is not the norm. Rather, he represents the pragmatic side of the chapter. Grandmaster Averstein represents the side that will keep you up all night, such as during the Raxus Civil War, where a hive world was being torn apart that had turned out to be a massive ritual by Tzeentch's changeling, a demon that can look like anyone. Stern successfully held the spaceport so the refugee shuttles could escape, but as the ships lifted off, he felt a psychic bore and realized that the changeling was on one of those shuttles. He didn't have time to search through all of them, and he didn't have time to even attempt to scan them. So to prevent the demon from reaching another planet, he realized that thousands of innocent refugees would be vaporized by the very men who had just saved them in order to save further billions. And then you also have the Battle of the Ghost Halls, which sounds like a title for an awesome Civil War themed horror movie. But for the Grey Knights, it would be anything but, as they were sent where no planets exist to find a bioacid scorched remnant of an Eldari craft world called Melantai, which functionally was a floating tomb, but it was infested with the Keeper of Secrets, Nikir, who was getting bloated on the soul stones of the dead. The Grey Knights sent in their purifiers, who moved through the desolate halls behind a literal wave of azure psychic flame. It was a ritualistic bloody slog where Justin Kidder Thrawn had to throw himself into the demon spirit just to trap the weapon in his own flesh, so his brothers could finish the ritual called the 12 Bloody Swords. When the dust settled, the Grey Knights didn't just leave. A score of purifiers stayed behind in the empty, haunted hall, standing over to guard over the alien dead until their kin could comfort them, after having banished Fulgrim's personal confidant from Caldor Drago, making his name by banishing Makara the Reborn, and eventually carving his name into one of the demon primarchs' still beating heart. And even Gary and Crow, stalling the legendary Skull Taker, they are the ones who closed close the prisons we don't know existed. They operate in a world of secrets. However, as the curtain draws near to a close in the 41st millennium, we find that knowledge isn't power, it's a death sentence. And nowhere is that more true than in the Purge of Jonal. This was a massive repository of secrets so rare they existed nowhere else in the galaxy but here. The sorcerer Ahriman of the Thousand Suns, basically the ultimate evil librarian of space wizards, attacked this world, slaughtered its defenders, and then just left. When the Invaders chapter arrived to retake the ruins, their famed recklessness led them straight into a trap, and they triggered a cascade of pink warp flame that incinerated every regular soldier. Then the walls of the librarium literally tore open and demons flooded in. The invaders fought for their lives for days, and normally the Inquisition would just have hit the Exterminatus button. But as it turns out, turning the planet cinders wasn't on their list yet. The books there were far too valuable, so 15 Grey Knights teleported into this meat grinder, saving nearly 5 times their number in fellow Marines. They went so far as to fight a Lord of Change, a greater demon of Tzeentch. But despite saving the world, there were only 12 of the invaders' Marines left, and every single one of them had to have their memories forcibly scrubbed. The knowledge was saved, but the men who saved it were never allowed to be remembered as the heroes they were. When Abaddon the Despoiler, the big bad of Chaos Undivided, targeted the death world of Pythos to open something called the Demon's Cache. This isn't just a regular portal, rather it's the backdoor to hell, literally, which had been sealed since the Horus Heresy. When the entire Dark Angels chapter showed up, alongside came a litany of Grey Knights, just as the sky tore open and literally turned into boiling blood. Reality buckled so hard that latent psychers started having their brains melt and their powers explode. The Grey Knights managed to fight their way to the cache and slam the door shut, starving the Chaos Legions of their warp fuel, forcing them to retreat. Unfortunately, Abaddon escaped with both his arms, and he took a prodigious psyker with him. This was a piece he supposedly needed, or he just retroactively decided it was. And so the planet Pythos was left as a sick and twisted nightmarish hellscape, and the records of the war were tucked away in some dark vault where the Grey Knights kept their names. The assault on Broga, an ice world that was being overrun by an orc warlord named Snapclaw. Here the Grey Knights quickly dropped in and conducted a series of surgical hyper-violent strikes where they killed the warlord and then left when the Fire Lord chapter arrived 3 days later in order to save the planet. They quickly found that the orcs were already in a blind retreat, and the primitive locals talked about steel saviors. No records, no names, just a myth left in the snow. But things aren't always so clean. Sometimes the Grey Knights step into a literal meat grinder, like in the Pandemonium of Sodham 5. This was an agri world caught in a nightmare scenario, and it was consumed by High Fleet Leviathan at the exact same time that a demon prince named Makar the Reborn was trying to be reborn again and turn it into his own private hellscape. The Sky Sentinels chapter arrived and basically said, yeah, this planet's gone, and prepared an exterminatus. But Grandmaster Bandan Kai showed up and told them to wait. He wasn't there to save the people, he was there to steal a book. This would be the Book of Pendergrass, a cursed tome of sorcery, and what followed was a 3-way war in the landscape that had become the penultimate death world, a fusion of tyrannid biostructures, demonic rot, and decaying imperial architecture. The Grey Knights had to hack their way through tyrannid spores, chimneys, all the while dodging unholy warp fires. At one point, Kai realized that they were surrounded, so he ended up calling an orbital bombardment on his own position. The Grey Knights huddled in their power armor in order to let the Imperial fleet rain hell down upon them, knowing that the Tyranids and demons wouldn't survive the blast. This left them to quickly grab the book and teleport out of there, as the planet was cracked open. And in a final chilling act of mercy, the Sky Sentinels, who had just fought alongside the Grey Knights, willingly surrendered themselves to the Inquisition for a total mind wipe, choosing to forget everything they had seen rather than live with the knowledge of what had actually happened. And that brings us to the present, or at least as close to now as the 41st millennium gets. Caldo Drago has, at least to some claim, returned to the Ark Realm in order to finish his feud with Makar once and for all, so he is not reborn again. But back on Titan, the air has been getting rather heavy, as the prognosticators, those who are psychic seers and live in the dark, are being haunted by visions of doom they can't quite name. Something is stirring deep beneath the surface of the moon itself. Something so ancient, so ancestral that it was there long before the Citadel was ever even a twinkle in the mind of the Sigillite. But as much as we know, this is generally just the end of an open-ended ghost story, where the prognosticators realize that the house that they've been living in is actually a grave. The Grey Knights have literally spent 10,000 years fighting the darkness outside, but ultimately the threat that might end up consuming them has been asleep under their feet the entire time. So now we've reached the edge of the map. For 10,000 years, the Grey Knights were the piece of bubblegum holding the leaking pipe from bursting, patching up the small holes in reality before the basement flooded. But then in the 41st millennium, this stability ended, not with a whisper, but with a scream. The fall of Cadia didn't just happen, it broke the galaxy in twain. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that tore across the stars like a jagged wound which won't stop bleeding, just kept oozing more and more demonic presences out there. We aren't just talking about small incursions anymore, we're talking about millions of worlds swallowed up in an instant. This is galactic scale, as entire sectors of space have just gone dark, cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, as the legions of the damned are pouring out of its maw, in numbers that make the previous 10,000 years look like nary a warm-up. This is the era Indomitus, and for the first time in history, the Grey Knights are truly and terrifyingly outnumbered and overwhelmed. But the grim irony here is that maybe that's exactly what they were built for. They spent centuries training for the end of the world, one which was prophesied. And now that it's here, they're acting like bolts of silver and lightning. Now they're operating simultaneously both in Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, the dark side of the rift where the Emperor's light can't reach, the domain of Lord Commander Dante, the King of the North. And they aren't following Reboot Guilliman or his Codex Astartes. They never have. They are following the secret blueprints left by Malcador the Sigillite, fighting a war that transcends politics, standard military strategy, and even reality itself. When you look at the map of the Grey Knights' activity before and after the rift, it's a chilling visualization. Before, it was a series of precise surgical dots. Now it's a chaotic weave of desperate strikes. They are the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, but the truth is that they are the only thing left between humanity and the total permanent night that seems to want to snuff them out. They have no primarch to look for guidance, only the genome of the Emperor himself flowing through their veins, as these are the ultimate expression of the Emperor and his will. But even the strongest blade can chip if it's used to strike at a mountain. The chapter remains organized into its 8 brotherhoods, led by brother captains and overseen by the Grand Masters. But the structure is being tested like never before. They are survivors of an era that is effectively over, fighting to protect a future that looks increasingly like a funeral pyre. They are the watchmen on the wall, and the Great Rift yawns ever wider. It's the final act of a story that started on a hidden moon 10,000 years ago. And while we don't know how it ends, we know that as long as one Grey Knight still breathes, the darkness hasn't won yet. And that, my friends, is the end of our deep dive into the Grey Knights. From the first 8 founders to the opening of the Great Rift, the Grey Knights have been the silver thread holding the Imperium together. It's a story of sacrifice, memory loss, and a purity so absolute it borders on the monstrous. Now, if you've enjoyed the journey into the 666th chapter of Space Marines, make sure to like and hit that subscribe button, as it really helps my channel stand out in the mire. The galaxy may be a dark place, but that only means that we have so much more to uncover. So go on and comment in the comments down below. And as always, thank you for watching, and stay safe out there.